The ambulance's wail had barely faded when we arrived at Magnolia Court, its siren song still echoing in my ears as I lifted my wife from the stretcher and carried her across the perfectly trimmed lawn. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her brow like dew on a morning rose, and every breath seemed to tremble with pain. Blood seeped through the thin fabric of her blouse, staining it a dark, ominous bloom. I could feel her panic in the grip of her hand as she reached for mine, eyes wide with fear. "Alan," she gasped, voice hoarse. "They let me in, right?" I nodded, heart pounding, trusting the paramedics who'd assured us she'd be fine as soon as they got her inside the clubhouse. But as we neared the heavy oak door emblazoned with the HOA crest, a towering figure blocked our path. Karen Whitaker, vice president of Magnolia Estates HOA, arms crossed, lips pressed into a smug line. Her gaze flicked from me to my wife, as if sizing up our worth. "Hold on right there," she commanded, chin jutting. "I need to see some identification." My wife's brow furrowed, pain deepening the furrow. "I'm bleeding," she stammered, clutching her side. Karen's eyes narrowed, dismissing her agony. "ID, please," she repeated. I felt a hot surge of anger, every instinct screaming to tear her aside and shove us through the door. But I was the chief of police, sworn to calm chaos, not create it. So I squared my shoulders and reached into my pocket. "Officer Jenkins," I said, producing my badge. Karen's lips curled. "We need her ID too." I glanced at my wife's hospital bracelet still on her wrist, proof enough of her condition. "This is her emergency ID," I said, gesturing to the bracelet. Karen squinted as if the embossed numbers were indecipherable. "I don't accept that," she declared. "She needs proof she belongs here. This is a private property." Behind her, a cluster of neighbors gathered, whispering. Some looked sympathetic, others shifting uneasily under Karen's glare. My wife's breath hitched, tears leaking from the corner of her eyes. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "I'm in so much pain." Karen snorted. "If you can't show proper credentials, you can't enter." My blood ran cold. The clubhouse held the medical station. Delaying her entry could cost her life. I placed my hand on Karen's shoulder, gently but firmly. "Karen," I said, voice low. "I'm with Oak Harbor PD. My wife is your neighbor, in critical condition. Let us in." She recoiled as if my touch burned her. "I don't care who you are. Rules are rules." The paramedics behind me exchanged startled looks. I turned to them and shouted, "Move her inside now." They hesitated, torn between protocol and Karen's blockade. Frustration exploded in me. I bent to meet her eyes. "This is a medical emergency, not an HOA meeting. Step aside." Karen's face rippled with fury as she raised her chin higher, as if she could challenge fate itself. "I will not be intimidated. Show me her ID, or I will have you both removed." A chill settled over the gathered crowd. I could feel the weight of my uniform, the authority of my badge, yet Karen seemed untouchable, sheltered by her self-appointed rule over this oasis of manicured lawns. I realized then she craved that power, the ability to decide who belonged, who didn't. A twist of fate revealed itself in the form of Mrs. Alvarez, a tiny woman in a nurse's scrub uniform, who emerged from the clubhouse. Her eyes blazed as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, voice steady. Karen turned on her heel, hissing, "She doesn't look like one of us. We need ID." Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, placing a hand on my wife's trembling shoulder. "She's bleeding internally. I've been monitoring her vitals. This is a matter of life and death." Karen held her ground, defiant. "I respect your profession, but community rules are clear." A hush fell. The paramedics edged closer, their urgency rising. Mrs. Alvarez's gaze locked onto mine, pleading. I nodded and raised my voice so all could hear. "Community rules cannot override human life. You have no medical credentials, no authority here." Karen's jaw twitched, her eyes narrowing to slits. Then Mrs. Alvarez produced a laminated badge proof of her license. "I authorize emergency access." Relief washed over the paramedics as they carried my wife inside. Karen stepped back, shoulders hunching, her power crumbling. But the true confrontation lay ahead, when truth and justice would strip her of the illusion she wielded so cruelly. As the door closed behind us, the neighbors murmured, eyes shifting from Karen to one another. I saw recognition in their gaze, a dawning awareness of how far she'd taken her authority. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, watered by the injustice they'd just witnessed. And in that moment, I vowed that Karen would face a reckoning as sharp as the pain my wife endured. Continuous prose continues. As the door swung shut behind us, the hush that settled over Magnolia Court felt heavy with unspoken truths. Neighbors peered from behind lace-curtained windows and half-open doors, their faces etched with surprise and a dawning anger. Word spread like wildfire. Karen Whitaker had tried to bar my wifey, a patient in agony, from receiving life-saving care because she didn't look like she belonged. Mothers clutched infants closer. Older couples exchanged quaking glances, recalling the countless petty fines and secret amendments Karen had imposed for years. The manicured paradise they'd built together now felt like a gilded cage, and in its center stood the jailer, stripped bare by her own cruelty. While nurses administered 4 fluids and monitored vital signs, I stood in the corridor outside the clubhouse offices, shoulders slumped with exhaustion and fury. My uniform felt heavier than any rain gear I'd ever worn on storm duty. I replayed Karen's glare, the contempt in her voice when she refused to accept medical credentials, her insistence on wielding HOA rules as if they were statutes of sovereign law. I thought of my wife's pale face, the tremor in her voice, the desperation in her eyes. This was more than an HOA dispute, it was a crisis of humanity. Footsteps echoed behind me. It was Mrs. Alvarez, the nurse who'd championed my wife's cause. Her blue scrubs were stained with antiseptic, but her eyes shone with determination. "Chief Jenkins," she began softly, "you need to file a formal complaint. This isn't just harassment, it's a willful obstruction of emergency medical care." I nodded, gratitude and resolve sparking in me. "I will," I said, thinking of the legal avenues, false reporting statutes, charges of abuse of authority, perhaps even civil suits for emotional distress. Karen was no lightweight amateur. She had resources and influence. But for every official she'd cajoled and coerced into silent compliance, there were now dozens of witnesses ready to speak the truth. Meanwhile, inside the clubhouse, neighbors gathered in whispered clusters. Mr. Kim, who'd once cowered when Karen fined him for planting the wrong shade of rose, now approached the front desk, his voice steady as he signed an incident report. Miss Thompson, whose cat she'd threatened to impound for loitering, recounted watching Karen turn away an injured resident. The clubhouse filled with the fervor of collective indignation. A makeshift committee formed on the spot, scribbling down names, drafting petitions to remove Karen from her HOA position and demand transparency in every committee decision. The very bylaws she had secretly amended were now being examined with a critical eye, every clause questioned, every amendment revoked. An hour later, as my wife rested under shaky nurse supervision, I made my way back outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, where a small crowd had gathered around the wooden sign someone had scrawled earlier, "Justice before rules." Beneath it lay piles of unsigned ballots calling for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. I recognized faces from the block families I'd visited during routine patrols, friends I'd shared coffee with at community events. Their solidarity warmed me, easing the ache in my chest. Here, in this unexpected uprising, lay the true spirit of community. Mutual care, not rigid control. Meanwhile, word of the incident reached the local press. Cameras and microphones invaded Magnolia Court the next morning, catching interviews with neighbors who spoke of fear, frustration, and finally relief. Headlines blared, "HOA vice president accused of life-threatening harassment," and police chief's wife denied emergency care. The backlash was swift. The HOA board, sensing the tide turning, called an emergency session to address the crisis. Invitations were sent by email to every member, promising an open forum. The clubhouse hall, once a shrine to Karen's unilateral decrees, was arranged with chairs in a circling unspoken gesture toward egalitarian dialogue. At the scheduled hour, I arrived with my wife leaning on my arm, still weak but rallying. The hall buzzed with anticipation. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by 2 board members whose loyalty had been unquestioned until now. Her composure was brittle. She attempted polite nods, but her eyes darted nervously. When the chairperson read the allegations, including witness testimonies and medical records, Karen's cheeks flamed. I watched as her facade cracked, first a tremor in her lips, then a quavering voice as she attempted to defend herself. "I was only enforcing community standards," she stammered. "We cannot let just anyone wander in." The room erupted in protest. Murmured objections swelled into shouts. Mr. Patel, normally reserved, shouted that he'd had to carry his own daughter home when she twisted her ankle because Karen refused him parking privileges during a sanctioned event. Others piled on, fines overturned, fees refunded, and now the ultimate sanction: removal from her vice president post and suspension from all HOA duties pending a full investigation. Humiliated, Karen attempted a final gambit. She accused the board of being weak, of allowing a law enforcement officer to bully an elected volunteer. But the board had already received legal counsel. The words fell on ears steeled by evidence and moral clarity. With a unanimous vote, Karen was stripped of her position, her key card deactivated. The gavel fell, echoing like a benediction. Relief washed over the hall as applause erupted. Karen sat frozen, mouth agape, as security escorted her out. A silence followed, broken only by the collective exhale of an oppressed community set free. In the days that followed, Magnolia Court transformed. The new board prioritized empathy. They instituted an emergency access protocol guaranteeing unfettered medical entry, created a citizen review panel for all fines, and launched monthly listen and learn sessions to hear concerns before imposing new rules. The clubhouse walls, once plastered with Karen's printed mandates, now displayed colorful flyers inviting neighbors to potlucks, book clubs, and volunteer cleanups. My wife, though still regaining her strength, attended a garden party where she and Karenhode quietly returned to collect her personal items. Crossed paths. Karen's eyes met hers, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse flicker across her features. My wife offered a tentative nod. Karen returned it, the gesture of fragile truce. A month later, as I watched families picnic under blooming magnolias, I reflected on the journey from pain to empowerment. Rules have their place, but they must bend to the higher law of compassion. My wife, leaning into me, whispered, "We did it." I squeezed her hand, heart full. The wooden sign remained at the gate. Justice before rules. Its chalk letters faded yet enduring. And above it, the words they'd added: community first. As the sun dipped low, I turned to the gathered neighbors and raised my voice. When we stand together, no tyrant, no matter how pompous, can deny us our shared humanity. Now I ask you, is our fight for justice right? Or should we have kept HOA matters private? Share your thoughts, right or wrong.